Hello, ENG 2100 online students. This is Dr. Woodward. In this video, I wanted to do a little bit of a scene analysis of parts of the film M. Now, I know that I promised to do this actually last week, I believe. The time keeps slipping away from me. This should help you when it comes time to sit down and do your first exam. And it'll also help you to kind of get a grasp on some of the ideas or some of the imagery you should be looking for in any of our films. I'm going to do a short video here on M, and then I'll sit down and do a short video on Floating Weeds as well, which is a completely different film, and so I'll get to highlight some different aspects of that one. So let's take a look at M first. And to begin with, let me start it running. What you'll see on the screen in front of you, Nero film, and then that shot of the hand, these are the original opening imagery from the film. It is a typical Fritz Lang film in that when he does make films in this period, his name, Fritz Lang Film, appears in this wonderful, bold font in front of you. So we'll keep it running. And the important thing to remember about this particular film is that this is Fritz Lang's first sound film. He has made, by this point, a number of silent films and is a well-known silent film director in Germany. One of his great silent films, Metropolis, you may have heard of. It is one of the first science fiction films ever made, and it is just one of the greatest silent films ever made. But what you probably already picked up on with this film is that as his first sound film, he is utilizing sound in a wonderfully rich and aesthetic way, so that even the fade in at the beginning, over the fade in at the beginning onto these children, we hear them singing. So we hear them singing and they sort of emerge from the darkness, creating almost an impression of the darkness that's going to be at the center of the film. And of course, as is typical with children, they are singing this little creepy song and not really recognizing that it is a creepy song. It's made creepier by the fact that there is a serial killer on the loose. And that's exactly what the older woman here is going to point out. But as we move up, I want to highlight a couple of important features. First of all, on the children, there was a high angle shot. So the camera is above them looking down at them. It creates the oval shape, or it reveals, I should say, the oval shape of their game. But it also puts them in the position of being very vulnerable. They're children playing as something observes them. The camera will then track slightly to the left and then pan up. And that, a pan is what happens when the camera, you could say it tilts up too, but often it's just called a pan. That's when the camera moves on its axis. So it tilts up, it turns to the left or to the right, or it tilts down. The track is when the camera physically, as a body, moves one direction or another. And that's what happens here is we track left and then pan up. And this shot right here, and I'm hoping that you can see the mouse on my screen here. I'm going to work under the assumption that this recording will allow that to happen. What you'll see, even if you can't see my mouse, is you'll see these wonderful diagonal angles, diagonal lines. So the portico or the deck or whatever we want to call that, jutting out, creates a shadowed area underneath. It creates another diagonal line here. The top of that portico or whatever creates a diagonal line. And then you have the fence also. Now you may look at that and think, yeah, nothing special about this. But what these diagonal lines do, descending as they do towards some point on a horizon that's actually off the camera, what those do is create a sense of depth, a three-dimensionality to a two-dimensional image in front of you. That technique is used by directors following really the Lumiere brothers at the very beginning of silent filmmaking, at the very beginning of filmmaking. They played around with positioning their camera to give this sense of depth. You can position the camera directly across from this portico and have the woman leaning over and still be actually able to keep the children into that shot, almost as though you're sort of looking at a stage. Some directors can make that choice. What that does is it creates a very two-dimensional image. It compresses everything, so it makes it more difficult to see the depth. By using these diagonal lines, directors in modern cinema create this sense of depth. They create this rich atmosphere in or on the screen. So I wanted to highlight that. I also want to highlight the social milieu that we're in. So we know from the beginning, those children playing by themselves are not dressed as rich children are. They're dressed as lower middle class children are. Their dresses are a little ragged. We see the mother figures up here at the top. And we have the little joke here where, of course, she tells the children to stop and the children keep going. But the mother figures are washerwomen, meaning that they are impoverished. This is not a wealthy group of people. The director gives us the sense of the labor, the physical labor involved in the job. It's, as she says, it's heavy. And the work they do is difficult. And these are the parents of the children who are vulnerable in this new world, vulnerable to the serial killer who's going around. And it's actually their social milieu that creates this vulnerability. And what Lang is doing is he is highlighting their vulnerability and, of course, increasing the sense of risk and the danger involved, especially when it comes to their children. A very technical shot there as a transition from outside the apartment to the inside of the apartment, keeping the sound as a linkage between the two. So the transition happens actually in the middle of her sentence. Technically, at this point, that's a very difficult thing to do. Now, these images that we're going to see are very well known. One of the most famous images is that of the child. But there's something I want to highlight before the child coming up to the poster, which we'll see in just a second. There's something I want to highlight before we get to that, and that's this shot here. If you notice, there are parents waiting for their children. And I don't know if you know anything about 1920s and 1930s attire, but if you look at these children, if you look at these parents, you will see, hopefully you will have noticed, that they are not poor. This man here with his collar, his fur collar, that's a very expensive jacket. This woman in her entire fur coat, with a child with a fur coat. Another woman in a fur coat. Another man in the fur collar. A woman with a fur stole around her neck. That woman, too, has a little fur stole around her neck. These are wealthy people. And the wealthy people are standing outside the school waiting for their children. It's a subtle shot. It is really very, very subtle. But what Lang does is he's contrasting the working woman and her the idea that she cannot take time off to go take care of her child, to make sure her child gets home safely. She has to work in order to feed her child. And therefore her child is made vulnerable, whereas the wealthy members of society are able to go pick up their children or send someone to pick up their children, and so that their children are not vulnerable in the face of this serial killer. Now, the other very famous image here is this series of shots, this scene that's also going to use parallel editing. So we have the vulnerable child. Notice that the angle is slightly high. And we're tracking along the street following her as she's bouncing her ball. Then the angle is going to shift. And the director Lang is going to take advantage of parallel editing here in a second. So here she is throwing her ball up. We pan up, track in. The camera itself moves in towards the sign. And what we see is the question of who is the murderer in that wonderful Gothic script. And then, if you have time to read the description here, then we're going to see the image of the murderer appear as a silhouette on the front of the poster asking who is the murderer. It's foreshadowing, quite literally, gives the name of the child Elsie Beckman. So the mother, is going to call out the child's name. And so we now know that the child is Elsie. And so she's calling for Elsie. We know who's in danger. The shadowy image of the figure appearing over the poster gives us directly this idea that this is the killer. The very distinctive voice of Peter Lorre is something that we're going to be able to pick up on later. He has a very, very distinctive voice, very difficult to think of him as anyone else than Peter Lorre. And so we'll be able to understand that this man, Peter Lorre, is the killer. But what Lang is also doing is he's not showing us Peter Lorre. He's making him into this more horrific, monstrous figure by not revealing who he is to us, by not revealing his character. The monster is a construct in all cinema. The monster is constructed here, and one of the ways of constructing the monster, as we'll see when we get to Alien, is to not show the monster. The more we see of the monster, the less afraid of the monster we are, right? If we see Michael in Halloween going around and buying a Coke, we're not going to be terrorized by Michael because of our understanding of him. So Lang is going to play with that theme, which isn't really even a theme in cinema yet, but he is going to start to tear it down, because the image that we see of Lang, of Beckert, the murderer, the images we see of him in the first half of the film create the monster, and the images we see of him in the second half of the film create the human being. And what Lang is forcing us to do is to come to terms with that monstrous human being. So the human being is revealed at the end, and we have to come to terms with the monster as a human in order to really make a determination about concepts like guilt, etc. It's a wonderfully done technique by Lang here. So her ramping anxiety, the child being led astray, these are parallel editing techniques. So we know that the child is being led astray, and then we edit, Lang edits to her and her anxiety, and then we edit back to the child being led astray, and then edit back to her and her anxiety as her voice calls out in the empty hallways. We have an imagery, we have some images here of the emptiness of this modern life, which is also, I think, a theme that plays in a lot of early German cinema. It's very much there in what's called the Weimar cinema and the silent film period. This notion that the city itself can be a threatening place. And the emptiness here is part of that threat or lack of humanity. And then we get this wonderful shot. And this is the shot that hammers home a lot of very important concepts. It hammers home the poverty. So the tablecloth is not in great shape. It's worn down at the corners. The plate is a little bit chipped. But the chair is very old and ragged. But look how carefully everything is put together. Now, this is what's known as a mise-en-scene, right? Mise-en-scene is the term that means everything that's put into the image that we see in front of us. And the mise-en-scene here is just exquisite because it reinforces her poverty at the same time as reinforcing her care and her love for her child, so that we know that she doesn't willingly let her child go wandering around by herself under threat of a serial killer. Instead, we know that she loves her child, but she is put in a position where she has to work in order to feed her child. And that tension is the tension of the modern world. You could say the tension of capitalism. You could say the tension of the industrial age. Workers are put in a position to have to sell their labor for their livelihood, which means selling their time for their livelihood, selling their time for the ability to feed their family, pulling them away from a more intimate relationship with their family, and also, as Lang points out, putting their family at risk to the dangers of the modern world. So it's a beautiful image in that it really encapsulates all of those tensions. And then, of course, parallel editing moves us from the empty chair to the ball left to roll in the park, to the balloon floating away. And that is more of those images that allow us to know, what happened to the child, which is reinforced by all of the furore of trying to figure out who the killer is. Now I want to skip forward to another very, very important moment here. I have to find it first. Imagery-wise, what I really want to focus on here is all the imagery. And that is where we begin to see Beckert as a human being. So up to this point, we have seen him looking into a mirror and pulling at his face as the doctor talks about insanity. We have seen his shoulder as he's scribbling the note to the newspaper. And again, all of those are intended to ramp up the sense of his monstrosity. And at this point, Lang begins to show us, as I said, the human being. He is, eating a bit of fruit here. Again, think of Michael in Halloween. Michael is not going to go around eating an apple. That would turn him into something other than the monster. The alien is not going to go shopping. That would turn the alien, the xenomorph, into something other than a monster. Lang is showing us the human being. And he is also going to show us the human being transitioning into the monster, being overwhelmed by his own psychological problems, as he sees in this very complicated shot the reflection, sort of a ghostly reflection, of a child who arouses that monstrous evil inside of him. And this shot here is in a mirror, and what he is actually seeing is a reflection of the girl in the window that he is looking through, but also reflected. The window that he's looking through has a reflection, and the girl is being reflected in some sort of mirror that he's looking at. You can see that mirror. Okay, so that is known as a graphical match, right? See the reflection of that mirror-like thing in the window, the window that he is looking through. And then we see the girl in that twisted square-like pattern there. So that creates the graphical match because he is looking inside of the shop, but the girl is to his right. And in order for the director to put together that really complicated space and yet still have Beckert looking into the shop, he has to create an image for us, the viewer, to recognize that Beckert is actually looking at the reflection of the girl, and that is that pattern that we see around her, which gets reflected in the image around him. That's known as a graphical match. So we see him being overwhelmed. He's going to start whistling as the girl moves behind him. And we're going to see this wonderful doubled image, one of the great images of film history. There's the back of the monster. There's maybe the human being. And remember that I suggested that not seeing Beckert makes him monstrous. Seeing his face and coming to terms with his humanity is a different idea. And what do we have here? We have the lack of his face matched with his face, but doubled, a ghostly apparition. And we can see the monster arising inside of him. And that doubled apparition reinforces this tension that exists inside of Beckert, a tension that's going to exist inside of our understanding of Beckert, a tension between the monster and the human. So, I hope that this has been helpful to analyzing some of the imagery, talking a little bit about technique, the importance of composition, the importance of editing, etc., and also talking a little bit about the meaning. The meaning that is created by this imagery is what is the most important part for you to really latch on to as a sort of a reader of the film. You want to understand how these images create meaning, and that's one of the purposes of the tasks that you have for the class. So I hope this has been helpful. I will put up some more videos later, and I'll do some more scene analysis and more discussion of some of the meaning involved. Thank you very much.